Segment 20A, it was time for a change. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the fall of the Russian Empire. The Romanovs had wasted too much time and effort expanding the boundaries of their empire without paying due diligence to the conditions within. While Nicholas I was stamping out Decembrists, chipping away at the Ottoman Empire, and throwing his weight around Europe, matters in his own country were coming to a boil. Eventually, the other European powers ganged up on Russia, inflicting upon her a disgraceful defeat. Nicholas I didn't live to see the end of it. His 37-year-old son, Alexander II, who reigned from 1855 to 1881, was left to clean up the mess. At a time when Russia needed another Peter or another Catherine, Alexander did his very best to fix things. At least he obtained better results than his son Alexander III or his dimwit grandson Nicholas II. In segment 20B, Tsars and Terrorists, we meet the Tsar liberator Alexander II, 1855 through 1881, a study in contrasts. Alexander II realized Russia's greatest underlying problem was the continued injustice of serfdom. And he gave the serfs their freedom in 1861, the year the American Civil War began. Yet the freedom was mainly in name only. And Alexander wound up alienating, at one time or another, all of Russia's classes: the landowning nobles, the small but highly involved middle class, and the masses of the peasants. The legacy of the Decembrists hardened into Narodism and into outright terrorism, and eventually cost Alexander II his life. His son and successor, Alexander III, took Nicholas I's conservative approach one step farther by attempting to impose order on Russia and the peoples of the Russian Empire, but with no real results. Alexander III's early death in 1894 brought his son Nicholas II to the throne with genuinely disastrous results. Segment 20C, War and Revolution, introduces us to Nicholas II, last of and one of the worst of the Tsars. Unsuited by training or inclination to rule as an autocrat, he tried his feeble best, unably assisted by his wife, Alexandra. Like her fellow little German princess, Catherine II, Alexandra was a woman of iron will, who trusted implicitly in her own intelligence and intuition. Unlike with Catherine II, Alexandra's implicit trust in herself was utterly unjustified. An anti-Semite like his father, and a hater of Asians to boot, Nicholas II developed the bad habit of listening only to those people he thought worthy: his wife Alexandra, and the circle of court flatterers. People of ability like Sergei Witt, who had brought on Russia's long-delayed industrial revolution, found themselves pushed to the side by nobles who hid the truth from him and encouraged him to get into successful little wars. This is how Russia wound up involved in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. This is how Russia brought on the 1905 revolution. In segment 20D, Not with a Bang, it's time to say goodbye to the Romanov dynasty, the Tsarist monarchy, and to the Russian Empire. Stolypin and Witt were dead, and Nicholas was left with only Alexandra and Rasputin to guide him through the increasingly drastic military and social beatings Russia endured during the First World War. Although Russians of all political persuasions, socialists all the way through to rightists, initially supported the Tsarist regime, Nicholas II managed to squander this goodwill with his insistence on retaining all autocratic power. Yet when the February Revolution sprang up in St. Petersburg, Nicholas meekly abdicated the throne and accepted his fate with resignation. Segment 20B, Tsars and Terrorists. Unlike his father, Nicholas I, Alexander II, who ruled 1855 to 1881, had little interest in the military. The Crimean War had not only exhausted and humiliated Russia, it had pointed out dangerous structural flaws in Russian government and Russian culture. After getting Russia out of the war in 1856, Alexander had to address internal issues like serfdom, education serfdom, industry serfdom, bureaucracy, and serfdom. Those Russians who had obtained a liberal education, the so-called intelligentsia, although alienated by Nicholas I, also understood that Russia had a problem. They pledged their support. How could Alexander II reconcile the needs of the peasants, which were Russian society's backbone, with those of the nobility, which governed the Russian Empire? The simplest and most principled approach would be to grant the peasants both their freedom and the lands which they farmed. But the landlords were hardly about to give their land up as a gift. Nor could the Russian state afford to buy the land outright for the peasants. At the same time, on the other side of the world, the United States was likewise wrestling with the issue of human slavery. While the American democracy resorted to secession and war before solving their problem, the autocrat Alexander could solve his problem with the stroke of a pen. Or could he? On March 3, 1861, Alexander II granted the peasants their freedom, but without any land. The peasants couldn't actually own the land until they paid off landlords via mortgages. In effect, this continued the peasant-landowner relationship. Until the mortgages were paid, the peasants would be hired laborers. The nobles who actually owned the land still charged the peasants for using forests, pastures, and other resources. To make up for losing their peasants, the nobles also got subsidies from government bonds. Had everything worked out as Alexander II planned, the now happy peasants would become prosperous, while the landowners worked with them and helped them better their land and better their farming techniques. This is exactly how it didn't work. The peasants bitterly resented not being given the land outright. The landowners found it more profitable to mortgage or sell their lands outright than farm them with free labor. A few aggressive peasants who became well off as a result of the emancipation became known as kulaks, or fists. But otherwise, Alexander's grand reform accomplished depressingly little, besides earning him the title Tsar Liberator. Alexander II's other initiatives were also a mixed bag. He sold Alaska to the United States in 1867, but he completed Russia's conquest of Central Asia. He promoted more local self-government for both the rural regions and the large cities, which made the government less dependent on the nobility. He reformed the army and navy, which had faltered so terribly in the Crimean War. He imposed a new and more modern penal code, along with a streamlined trial system. On the other hand, he was just as determined as his father had been to make Russians out of all the empire's non-Russians. Of course, the Poles, the Finns, the Tatars, the peoples of the Caucasus, to name just a few of the larger nationalities, had no interest in becoming Russians. Moreover, as Alexander's reign continued, the educated class, or intelligentsia, started turning against him. So even while Alexander was enacting his most important reforms, he stuck to the Romanov tradition of complete autocracy, just like Peter the Great just like Catherine the Great, just like Alexander the First. So when the intelligentsias kept crying for a role in public affairs, Alexander's police broke up their meeting and even put them in jail. The stifling of the intelligentsia led to the Narodniks, an opposition movement taking its name from Narod, the Russian word for people. The Narodniks, most of whom were college students, wanted to rebuild Russian government based on socialist theory and the peasant commune, or mir. In 1874, Narodniks dressed themselves as peasant men and peasant women and went into the countryside to work. They hoped to bond with the peasants and gain the peasants' support for continued reform. But the peasants were suspicious of all city folk, beat quite a few of them up, and the experiment failed. Next came the 1876 formation of the secret Land and Liberty Society, aiming to stir up peasant revolution. Alexander's secret policemen broke up Land and Liberty, but its most devoted members reorganized as the terrorist movement People's Will. After 6 unsuccessful attempts on Alexander's life, People's Will successfully blew him to bits in St. Petersburg on March 1, 1881. The Church of Spilled Blood to this day stands on that site. Ironically, Alexander had just that day unofficially approved legislation leading to a constituent assembly. Alexander II was not a perfect czar, but he had genuinely tried to better Russia, and he deserved a much kinder fate. Like his grandfather Nicholas I, Tsar Alexander III, ruled 1881 to 1894, came to the throne in a time of calamity. Also like his grandfather, Alexander III saw militarism and autocracy as the only solution to Russia's ills. In short, he brought back the policy of official nationality. Alexander III supported the Russification of national minorities and helped extend the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church into all parts of Russian life. His secret police, the Okhrana, harassed all political parties out of business regardless of their political orientation. There were certain advances during Alexander III's reign. Russia began to industrialize rapidly, and a railroad network began spreading out to the Pacific coast. As an autocrat, Alexander considered unnatural Russia's alliance with the Republic of France, but he hated even more the reunified Germany which had appeared on his doorstep. An added bonus was the massive infusion of French capital, which greatly aided Russian industrialization. Rapid industrialization also meant a rapidly growing working urban class. But this was at the moment just of interest to the handful of Russian Marxists, like Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Finally, Russia had no external wars during Alexander III's reign, for which he is remembered today as Alexander the Peaceful. The name Alexander the Reactionary is equally appropriate. Aside from reviving Nicholas I's official nationality policy, Alexander III was also rabidly anti-Semitic and believed his father had been killed by Jews. The first years of his reign were marked by pogroms, or riots, in which Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, and Moldovans rioted against the local Jewish communities. Not only did Alexander III refuse to stop the pogroms, he officially blamed the Jews themselves and increased restrictions upon them. The city of St. Petersburg is filled with must-see buildings, and one of the most important is Alexander III's tribute to his assassinated father, the Church of Spilled Blood. If only it were his most important legacy. Only 36 when he became Tsar in 1881, Alexander III looked forward to a long reign. He therefore seemed in no hurry to train his eldest son, the Tsarevich Nicholas, in running the Romanov family business. But on November 1st, 1894, he died of nephritis in the Crimea, setting the stage for disaster. Even under the best of circumstances, a person of Nicholas's limited intelligence and non-existent willpower would have made a poor Tsar. Together with his iron-willed but equally dim wife, born Princess Alix of Hesse, Emperor Nicholas II would be burning down the house. Segment 20C, War and Revolution. May 18, 1896 was coronation day for Emperor Nicholas II and his wife, the Empress Alexandra. On the coronation eve, thousands of Muscovites gathered in a field near the festivities, hoping they would receive some expensive souvenirs. At dawn, chaos erupted, and the undermanned police force could not establish order. 1,300 people were trampled to death and likely another 1,300 injured. But the coronation went on, and that night Nicholas and Alexandra attended all the formal balls held in their honor. The remaining 23 years of their reign went little better. Once crowned, Nicholas announced his intent to reign in the autocratic Romanov tradition. Since he and Alexandra both believed in the concept of official nationality, the opinions of the Russian people were insignificant. Insensibly, this inattention drove much of the intelligentsia right into the arms of the radicals. Yet another casualty of official nationality. One man Nicholas did listen to, more carefully than he should have, was Alexandra's cousin Willie, better known as Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Hoping to turn Russia's attention away from Europe, Wilhelm exhorted Nicholas to strike eastward. Not that Nicholas needed any encouragement. Manchu China was collapsing, and Russia had already grabbed Port Arthur, near modern Qingdao, by the way, in 1898. In 1902, Russia had also grabbed parts of Manchuria and Korea. The Japanese wanted to negotiate with the Russians over Korea, but Nicholas refused to deal with a nation of what he called monkeys. Nicholas may also have believed that what one of his ministers called a victorious little war would rally public support behind his rule. The Japanese had no intention of letting their enemy strike them first. On February 6, 1904, the Japanese fleet launched a sneak attack on the Russian Far East Fleet in the Port Arthur harbor. The Russo-Japanese War had begun. The Japanese initially had the advantage because of their greater concentration of forces. Russian reinforcements, on the other hand, had to be sent the length of the Trans-Siberian Railway. While the Russian Far East Fleet was being shot to bits by the Japanese Navy and land-based artillery, Nicholas II ordered his Baltic Fleet to sail two-thirds of the way around the globe to join in the fight. By the time the Baltic Fleet arrived, Russian land forces had already surrendered Port Arthur and Mukden. But orders were orders, and the Baltic Fleet was sent to the bottom of the ocean by Japanese gunfire. By this time, both nations were ready for peace, even if Nicholas II personally wasn't. And a peace was brokered by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1906. The terms were comparatively equal, but the world wasn't fooled. David had taught Goliath a lesson, and for the second time in 50 years, Russia's military was the joke of the world. Kaiser Wilhelm was smiling. Oppressed people around the world started to hope that the colonial era was coming to an end. Yet this so-called victorious little war had further drastic consequences on the home front. The Japanese sneak attack had indeed united the Russian people behind their Tsar, but not for long. Large parts of rural Russia were suffering from a series of bad crops, and the starving peasants revolted. As in previous uprisings, they started burning the homes and farms of the large landowners, but this did not get them much attention during wartime. The workers of St. Petersburg, oppressed by terrible working conditions and spiraling prices, ended 1904 with a massive strike. On January 9, 1905, a group of workers led by Father Georgy Gepon marched to the Winter Palace to present their Tsar a polite, respectful petition asking for universal suffrage, better working conditions, and an end to the war. What they got instead was a hail of bullets from the Tsar's bodyguards. More than 1,000 people were killed. This was the spark that let the powder keg blow up. Terrorism ran wild. Assassinations were common. In February 1905, the governor of Moscow, Nicholas's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, was blown up by a terrorist bomb. Save for the landowners, who certainly had their own separate issues, all Russia, it seemed, had a legitimate grudge against Tsar Nicholas's misrule. The peasants were starving. The urban workers were hungry. The intelligentsia resented being held away from public affairs. Even the military was angry that they were set up to fail in the Russo-Japanese War. Isolated protests changed into widespread revolution. Workers and intelligentsia marched in the cities. In the rural districts, the peasants kept burning manors and lynching noblemen. In St. Petersburg, an organization called the Soviet, or Council, or Union, sprang up and claimed power, and Nicholas II was in a tight spot. Since not even Alexandra could devise a way to bring back autocratic power, he was forced to hold his nose and permit a limited parliamentary democracy. The new parliamentary assembly, called the Duma, was intended by Nicholas only to rubber stamp his personal decisions. Thrilled to get to take part in government at last, the intelligentsia formed political parties and decided whether to cooperate with the Duma or not. Meanwhile, Nicholas had found the strong right-hand man he'd always wanted, Peter Stolypin, an individual so self-confident that the revolutionaries immediately tried to blow him up. In response, Stolypin sent squadrons of soldiers into the countryside. Terrorists were tracked down, tried, found guilty, and usually executed right on the spot. So, unfortunately, were many innocent people. But Stolypin was no knee-jerk counter-terrorist. He saw the Tsarist government's only chance for survival was to raise the peasants' living standard, somehow. This Stolypin tried to accomplish by making it possible for the more ambitious farmers, the kulaks, or fists, to rise to the top of the peasant class and pave the way for the slower peasants. Of course, the landowners were appalled. They preferred their peasants poor and ignorant. The revolutionaries were likewise appalled that Stolypin might find a peaceful solution to the peasant question. Never a particularly pleasant person anyway, Stolypin also made a powerful enemy in Rasputin, the so-called Mad Monk of Russia, who alone, or so it seemed, could stop the hemophiliac Tsarevich, Alexei's, bouts of profuse bleeding. As a grateful mother, Alexandra felt deeply indebted to Rasputin. As empress, Alexandra felt that Rasputin's help could bring similar blessings upon the Russian state. When Stolypin gave Nicholas II a dossier chock full of Rasputin's seedy drinking and sexual antics, Nicholas did nothing but shrug. By the time that Stolypin was assassinated before Nicholas's very eyes at the Kiev Opera House in 1911, the two were no longer on speaking terms. So passed the last man who could have saved the Romanov dynasty from Nicholas II. Segment 20D, Not with a Bang. The First World War began with a terrorist act. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, was killed in Bosnia by the Serbian Gavrilo Princip. Egged on by Germany, Austria presented Serbia with a list of non-negotiable demands. Russia supported Serbia's predicament. The Serbian government was appalled at this murder as well, but they advised their fellow Slavs to give in. Austria invaded Serbia anyway, and the war was on. On one side were the Allies, Russia, Great Britain, France, and Italy. On the other side were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The United States stayed out at first. To be fair, Tsar Nicholas II was desperate to avoid war. The same cannot be said of his friend Willy. Many prominent Germans, noticing Russia's growing industrial might, feared what a stabilized, modernized Russia could do to Germany economically and militarily. They advised preemptive action against Russia. Analysis of the First World War's causes will go on forever, but it's hard to see how anyone could stop it. Russians would never stand for their fellow Orthodox Slavs getting steamrollered in Serbia. As it was, Russians from all walks of life, including socialists, supported Nicholas's decision to fight, at least for the time being. The name of St. Petersburg sounded too German. Actually, it was Dutch, so the capital was renamed Petrograd. Almost immediately, the disasters started rolling in. In August, 2 massive Russian invasion armies were cut to bits and sent running back toward the border. And from that point on, Russia would be on the defensive. Eventually, 15 million Russians served in the war, and the number of Russian family members affected can only be guessed at. With few exceptions, the Russian army was led by noble dimwits more concerned with court politics than with the laws of modern warfare. Russian tactics consisted of sending waves upon waves of soldiers into German and Austrian machine gun fire. Yet, the Russian bloodbath served the Allied cause. Had the Russians not tied down massive amounts of German troops on the Eastern Front, the Germans might otherwise have defeated the British and French before the Americans could have made any difference. Predictably, the Russians at home became more and more disgusted with the war. As with the Russo-Japanese War 10 years earlier, the war's victims were precisely who made the biggest direct contribution to the economy: young male peasants and young male factory workers. In autumn 1915, Nicholas II took personal control, even if only nominally, of the Russian forces. But all this meant was chaos back in Petrograd and Moscow. Whether Alexandra herself was appointing and dismissing the constant stream of ministers, or whether it was Rasputin or nobody in particular, the Russian government crumbled into bits while the Tsar was away playing soldier. Food production suffered from the shortage of able-bodied males. Even peasants in the fields went hungry. The railroad system suffered from bad management, which complicated transport and also consumer goods. In the cities, wages could not keep up with the skyrocketing cost of living. The political parties continued to bicker, accomplishing nothing. In the countryside, those soldiers who survived their wounds and made it back to the villages told horror stories of bad food, brutal commanders, and no weapons. This made it pretty hard to recruit fresh troops, and it gave an opening for radical propagandists such as the Bolsheviks, who encouraged soldiers to desert. Some very odd solutions popped up, the most famous being the murder of Rasputin in December 1916. The killers included the Tsar's first cousin, Grand Duke Dmitri, Prince Felix Yusupov, a transvestite who was the wealthiest man in Russia, and a minister of the Duma. Yet the poisoning, shooting, and ultimate drowning of the royal family's seedy confidant changed nothing. The Romanov dynasty and the Russian Empire died not with a bang, but with a barely audible whimper. The winter of 1916-1917 had been unusually cold for Petrograd, further complicating the process of getting food into town. On February 18, 1917, the workers of Petrograd's largest employer, the Putilov Works, went on strike. February 23, 1917, was International Women's Day. The women of Petrograd turned this into a protest march, as women will do, over the shortage of bread, which women consider important. The Putilov strikers were happy to help. A crack detachment of the Russian army was sent in to help the Petrograd garrison put the rebellion down. But by this time, even the elite soldiers were angry. They went over to the rioters instead. Finally, Nicholas II himself left the supreme headquarters on the Eastern Front to take charge in Petrograd. What he hoped to accomplish when he got there, we'll never know. He never got there. Troops allied to the Bolsheviks cut the railroad line to keep Nicholas from reaching the capital. And stuck on the military train with him, Nicholas's military advisors finally talked him into abdicating on March 15th in favor of his younger brother, Grand Duke Mikhail. When Mikhail refused to accept the throne, it marked the formal end of the Tsarist regime. No doubt, Nicholas II's unique brand of thick-headed inertia speeded the process, but his predecessors all shared in the blame. Peter the Great had dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the West, but in his haste to do so, he effectively prevented the Russian Orthodox Church from growing along with the nation. Orthodoxy might have developed into a force supporting Russia not just spiritually, but culturally and intellectually, just as it had done during the time of the Mongol yoke. Instead, it just became another arm of the government. For all of her encyclopedic learning, Catherine the Great had largely diagnosed Russia's problems in her Nakaz of 1766, but only made them worse. Her grandsons Alexander I and Nicholas I succeeded in making Russia the most respected military power in Europe. Even though these czars recognized the economic and moral evils of serfdom, neither acted upon them. Insisting on preserving their autocratic rights, they stunted the growth of a socially conscious intelligentsia. Nicholas's unique contribution was a police state based on the mind-numbing principle of official nationality. Autocracy, nationality, and orthodoxy. Without a chance to play a responsible part in Russian public affairs, many talented young men and young women chose opposition and revolution. Alexander II made a commendable effort to liberate the serfs, but he settled for half measures, which messed up his other attempted reforms. Had he embraced some sort of constitutional monarchy, he might have retained the support of the intelligentsia, and he might even have avoided getting blown up. Alexander III was a carbon copy of his reactionary grandfather Nicholas. Even so, he made great strides in developing Russia's economy. Finally, he was locked in too deeply to official nationality to prepare Russia for the 20th century. Whatever else one can say about Nicholas II personally, or as Tsar, he bore his burden stoically. If only he had been granted more intelligence and less patience, Russia might have been spared the agonizing consequences of the Bolshevik October Revolution. Segment 20E, Conclusions. 1. The class divide. Alone among his fellow czars, Alexander II took drastic action to address the evils of serfdom. The emancipation plan he decreed in 1861 was not perfect, and in the end it pleased nobody completely. Yet Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1862 was also a half measure, freeing only the slaves in the entire Confederacy. Less forgivable was Alexander II's unwillingness to win over the alienated intelligentsia by integrating these people into public affairs. The Russian governing class was deprived of fresh blood, and the intelligentsia itself became a breeding ground for revolutionary discontent and revolutionary terrorism. The rise of an urban working class only added to the discontent. Even though the Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin had a workable plan for fixing agriculture, not even Stolypin had a solution for the growing pains caused by Russia's rapid industrialization. 2. Terrorism. Both Alexander III and Nicholas II had watched the blown-up Alexander II die of his wounds. Their strong stands against internal terrorism were quite understandable. Less understandable was the ineptitude of their secret police, the Okhrana. The Okhrana and the revolutionary movements literally infiltrated each other to the point where Stolypin's murderer is thought to have been a police agent. Both Alexander III and Nicholas II began to withdraw themselves and their families from public sight, with drastic consequences for their popularity. Meanwhile, the terrorists themselves, many of whom were young men and young women from prominent, well-off Russian families, provoked at least as much admiration as they provoked outrage. As sickening as this admiration for terrorism was, it underscores the vast divide between the wannabe autocrat Nicholas II and the people of the Russian Empire. Up until the First World War, it was like both the Romanovs and the revolutionaries had dug in for the final countdown. 3. Militarism. For some time after the Crimean War ended in 1856, Russia avoided international entanglements to build up her strength internally. In 1867, the unprofitable colony of Alaska was sold to the United States. And back in the day, it was believed that the United States got swindled. But an empire's validity is based on the strength of its military. And while Alexander III was wise enough to avoid foreign wars entirely, Nicholas II, his dim-bulb son, was far more militaristic. Nicholas could not keep his hands off of Manchuria, Korea, and especially the city of Port Arthur. Dizzy with initial success, Nicholas welcomed a war with Japan, hoping that a successful little war would help Russia's prestige abroad and win him support at home. Wrong. What he got instead was a loss against Japan and the revolution of 1905, which nearly toppled his regime. Even Nicholas saw the First World War coming. He actually did everything in his power to avoid it. It would have been better for Russia had Nicholas seen the revolutions on the horizon too, which the First World War didn't cause, admittedly, but merely sped up. Nicholas wasn't that bright. 4. The rule of law. After establishing an assembly called the Duma in his October 1905 manifesto, Nicholas II did everything in his power to undercut it. So did his Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. Some of the political parties cooperated with the government. Others, like the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, opposed it bitterly. Nicholas's government still held the military trump card over this sad attempt at democracy. And as Stolypin showed, when he brutally put out the last fires of the 1905 revolution, he was not afraid to play the military card at all. With the onset of the First World War, political bickering settled down and terrorism ceased for a while. But Nicholas II insisted on maintaining autocracy to the bitter end. It's sad to say that even at the end of the Russian Empire, despite the great strides the Russian civilization had made, its subjects enjoyed scarcely more rights than they did under Ivan the Terrible. This sad situation, more than any other, carried with it the seeds of the Russian Empire's fall. If the peasants had been allowed to share in the rule of law, if the intelligentsia had been allowed to play a role in public affairs, if some kind of meaningful constitutional monarchy could have been invented, if. The remedy to the Russian Empire's ills would be in many ways worse than the ills themselves. It was called the Soviet Union.